To folks on the outside who are not familiar with cannabis, the medicinal qualities of the plant can appear overblown and a pipe dream, quite literally. And they are right that most of us talk about cannabis as a panacea because it does offer relief from so many bodily ailments. And those folks say, how can one herb fix so many things in a human? That simply cannot be true. But the thing is that cannabis really only does one thing. It balances and strengthens and interacts with the body's endocannabinoid system. Balancing and activating that one system is a very big deal, though, because the endocannabinoid system touches all the other mission-critical systems in the human body. At the same time, though, not all humans react to cannabis in the same way. By now, most cannabis users understand how completely the terpene profile controls the quality of euphoria that cannabis gives us when it's smoked or vaped. And terpenes themselves influence humans in differing ways, which is why some folks can smoke any and all equatorial cultivars, while I have to be really picky with mine, or I get a racing heart that I find dysphoric. We all have our very own personal and individual relationship with cannabis. All of this is to say that cannabis helps the endocannabinoid system of all humans, but which cannabis cultivar, used in which way and at which dose, are all variable from human to human. It really makes me cringe to see cannabis folks arguing on social media about some patient's dosing protocol, because to really understand how best to administer cannabis to a patient really takes a pretty in-depth patient intake or some advanced self-awareness and self-diagnosing. Folks are usually arguing as if dosing is the same for everyone, and it very much isn't. Whole plant cannabis medicine is a great tool, and we need to recognize how to use it is dictated to a large degree by the physical health, nutrition, expectations, mental health, and experience with cannabis that the patient has. Every cannabis patient is different and deserves to be treated uniquely. If you want to learn about cannabis health, business, and technique efficiently and with good cheer, I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter. We'll send you new podcast episodes as they come out, delivered right to your inbox, along with commentary on a couple of the most important news items from the week and videos too. Don't rely on social media to let you know when a new episode is published. Sign up for the updates to make sure you don't miss an episode. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and I'm your host, Shango Los. My guest today is Dr. Chris Spooner. Dr. Spooner is a naturopathic doctor with 20 years clinical experience with specialties in gastrointestinal and integrative medicine, among others. He has been a board member and vice chair of the College of Naturopathic Physicians of British Columbia since 2008. Dr. Spooner is presently on the medical advisory boards of several integrative care and cannabis companies. Even with all of that, Chris still keeps an active private clinical practice at Paradigm Integrative Medicine, helping real people every day. Today, we're going to discuss the wide range of variables at play in the human body to consider when making cannabis recommendations. During the first set, we talk about those body variables and how unique each human is when it comes to cannabis medicine. During the second set, we review the analytical tools and tests we can use when performing a patient intake or serious self-diagnosis. And in the third set, we talk about easy-to-access whole foods that you can eat to support a thriving endocannabinoid system. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Hey, Shango, great to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. So let's start by giving everybody a really good idea of the variables at play when discussing the use of cannabis medicine. You know, humans are not at all the same, even though textbooks about the human body and the discussion of the endocannabinoid system may suggest that they are. So let's start. Would you please give us a sense of the variety of health variables that could potentially impact the use of cannabis medicine and should be considered when choosing how best to use cannabis to relieve ailments?
Sure. Super interesting question, and this definitely falls within kind of, my integrative medicine, functional medicine, naturopathic medicine approach. And I don't, this is an approach that I use pretty much with all my patients, whether it be cannabis medicine or not, and essentially, what we're really trying to do is recognize that, you've got individual patients. And I think one of the challenges that we have with medicine right now is that, we're using evidence-based medicine. We're trying to protocols and standardization part of it. And what we've forgotten is that we're kind of creating medicine by average. I was just having this conversation with a patient yesterday. I was showing them a data set, and some slides saying, okay, well, and here's this nice graph line down the middle of it, but, when you take a look at the number of data points that are actually on the best fit line, there's only 4, and the other 150 are above or below. So that starts to become something that's become a real sort of foundation on how I work, with patients on this, which is, we need to recognize, and we've got to really dig into these unique aspects of patients, and so, when I start off, there's a couple things that I take a look at first and foremost, and it's sort of a base of a pyramid, and which ones, each one sort of successively builds on the next. And so, to me, optimizing nutrition is got to be key in this, right? And so, I think that, when you start looking at the cannabinoids and the endocannabinoids in particular, all of these things are basically, built off fats, in our body. And so, our the macronutrient part of it, the omega-3s, omega-6, saturated fat status of our diets becomes really, really important. Because I think we need to remember the endocannabinoid system is a homeostatic regulatory system, right? Which means that, you can only push it so far versus the other. It's actually a balancing thing. So if we're trying to create a super intense therapeutic effect on it, I think we're going to cap that out at both ends of that along the continuum of, one extreme versus the other. So we need to look at ways to build capacity within that and try to unload it so that we allow the endocannabinoid system to balance as opposed to push.
Before you move on, we're not even 3 minutes into the show and you've already blown my mind. Did you just say that if our nutrition is lacking, the cannabinoid therapy will only be able to do so much because our body won't have the capacity to properly use the cannabis we're introducing?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. Please continue.
Yeah. Well, and that, and so that's, you can carry that theme through the whole range of things that I'm suggesting here. So, I mean, if we start off, like I said, with optimizing the nutrition, and again, I mean, you can talk about things like fats and protein status and amino acids and such. If we talk about micronutrients, I mean, there's, the area that I do a lot of work with my patients is nutrigenomics. So we'll use like the 23andMe platforms. One we tend to use the most. It's some people have concerns about that. For a number of different reasons, mostly about where their health data and things like that's going in, but it certainly is accessible and that's a whole other conversation we could have. But I mean, certainly within that, you see variability within patient populations on, again, how they build different parts of things that intersect with the endocannabinoid system. And those are things that can be modulated, again, macronutrient and micronutrients. So, that's probably, again, that's a fairly deep dive into, okay, what's the diet that you're looking at? Let's take a look at some of the physical signs and symptoms. We look at various different nutrient deficiencies, and that starts to become part of the conversation and basic, history building, that I do. Next thing, we take a look at is hormones, and hormones build off of your nutritional status as well, too. And again, we're talking estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. We can move into some of the neurotransmitter part of that as well, too, where they're talking dopamine, serotonin, epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol levels. All of those have huge interplays, with regards to effects on metabolism and blood glucose. And so again, you need to have, if your carbohydrate metabolism and blood sugar's off, is that, an impact on cortisol or a response to altered cortisol status and adrenal function. And so again, that's your dietary habits start to build in on that as well too. And so that starts to become the next part of that. We also take a look, and if we look at the nutrigenomics part of this, things like, catechol, like dopamine, for example, is a catecholamine, and it's impacted by a whole host of network of different, estrogen metabolism, cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and those build on, again, various different micronutrients like B vitamins and methylation status on neurotransmitter production. So suddenly now you're seeing this intersection here, and how those hormones and neurotransmitters are cleared out of the system, particularly through something called catechol O-methyltransferase, which is an enzyme that's the warrior versus the warrior phenotype, if anybody's been following that aspect of it. And that has, in my experience, has significant implications for endocannabinoid tone and response, and furthermore, it probably explains to a large extent what's going on, with, for example, the gender differences that we see, how women versus males respond differently. And largely that has a significant, interplay with, estrogen metabolism and impacts on dopamine. So, that starts to become something that's super, super interesting. So there's that element of it. The next phase that I start taking a look at is the gastrointestinal tract. I do tons of work. I mean, it's one of the areas that I work up outside of cannabis medicine with several other companies which is on microbiome. And, so that suddenly ties in hugely with our, endocannabinoid. There's some really interesting research that takes a look at the endocannabinoid system as kind of the intersection between the gut microbiome, and the gut-brain axis, and the implications of that on endocannabinoid system functioning are fascinating as well too. So this becomes something that, again, when you base it on our nutrition, I mean, the types of fibers that we start to make, like, for example, if we wanted to dig down into this a little bit more, and again, we've got some times to talk about this, so you'll probably find I skitter around over places, but let's take a look at something like GABA. The endocannabinoid system, the CB1 receptors are they have significant impacts on GABA and glutamate. Those are the excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. And one of the interesting things is if we take a look at the gut microbiome, butyrate is a short chain fatty acid. Anybody who's ever smelled rancid butter, that's butyrate. And but it's produced by the microbiome in the large intestine, the Bacteroides species of bacteria that colonize the large intestine. And it gets it by fermenting different types of fibers, particularly things like psyllium powder and oat bran are two big sources of it as well too. There's several others as well, but that's what I use predominantly. And butyrate is actually the building block for GABA, right? Gamma aminobutyric acid, so butyrate, butyric. So suddenly now you're taking a look at one of the major, sort of regulatory neurotransmitters within the endocannabinoid system. The significant component of it is being generated in our gastrointestinal tracts by our microbiome and the type of fiber that we eat. So suddenly that, has huge implications on this as well too. So that becomes a really significant element. And, I do seminars for continuing medical education for patients on gut ecology and gut microbiome and how that works and intersects with immune function and T cell polarization and this type of thing as well too. So there's some really interesting intersections. And again, when we start talking about endocannabinoids, we start thinking about anti-inflammatory effects, modulating effects, how much of that is this intersection with gut microbiome and T cell polarization through, mucus associated and lymphoid tissue and this type of thing. So that's that part of it. My past work was in environmental medicine. I did a postdoctorate down in Phoenix at the Southwest College of Naturopathic Medicine. We created a environmental medicine center of excellence. Dr. Walter Crinian, who you guys actually probably up in the Washington State area would know him. He was quite highly regarded for environmental medicine, had a very large clinic up there. And so I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time and learn from him. So, we got to spend, things like working with the Phoenix Fire Department and setting up a wellness center and working at sort of, getting heavy metals out of guys that went to Hurricane Katrina and, 9/11 and stuff, and trying to get rid of, various different toxins and the implications on that. But that part became part of these detoxification pathways. And certainly in that work, that's probably where I ended up getting a lot of my interest in genomics, because we were taking a look at genetic variation in cytochrome P450 enzymes, which are the enzymes that clear out a large, the significant amount of what we call xenobiotics or, chemicals within the environment, how those things get out of our system is run through the liver, which is this big filter, and so that has implications on drug metabolism and how that clears out. And again, when we took a look at environmental pollutants, things like solvent exposures and pesticides and heavy metals, what we looked at is that had, three sort of areas that they affected: neurological, immune function, and endocrine. And so, suddenly when we start taking a look at the impacts of environmental compounds and these xenobiotics, and how that starts to impact, hepatic function and clearance, and, how genetic polymorphisms and variations start to impact that, then suddenly again, suddenly there's all sorts of, connections and intersections happening with the endocannabinoid system, and certainly, Ethan, Dr. Russo and I were just doing that work on, the genetics of cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, and what we were seeing in there was, some genetic variants on some of these drug clearance pathways, which again intersects with pharmacogenomics and potentially, this environmental medicine type thing, and certainly, one of the things that I look at in the work that I've done with some of the licensed producers up here in Canada, is we've really tried to emphasize, hey, look, pesticides are a problem, but even especially with hemp, for example, one of the things I think that gets, missed a little bit is that hemp is a bioaccumulator of cadmium, right? And so now you're going to have to start taking a look and paying attention, and those heavy metals need to be looked at, and especially when we're doing concentrates, is that starting to be something? And cadmium's a fairly nasty metal that has some significant implications, particularly on estrogen metabolism. So there's your detoxification pathways.
Right on. So for those who are keeping score at home, I'm seeing 4 variables so far that you delineated, that you talk to your patients about as you are moving towards your diagnosis and figuring out cannabis protocols. Number 1 being, what is the state of their nutrition, because they have to have the capacity to be able to intake the cannabinoids. 2 was hormones. 3 was the status of their GI tract, and 4 would be environmental influences that might be acting on the endocannabinoid system. Before we go into those any more depth, is there more on that list?
That's it.
All right. So a couple of things that I want to focus on, which just glowed in your answers, but I didn't want to interrupt you. So the first thing is you mentioned, with some amount of coarseness to it, that there are gender differences when it comes to using cannabis, and there is just not a lot being talked about on that. Would you go into that a little bit?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Let's see, where do we start on this one?
Well, how about how do the health benefits of using cannabinoid medicine differ between men and women and others?
Yeah, there's a couple different areas that I would look at this, and I guess where I was trying to think is how do we put this into a logical framework that makes sense? So I think where I'd probably start with this. We see different responses. Like women in general have different responses to dopamine, and that's a large factor because dopamine and estrogen get cleared out through this COMT enzyme, right? And so what tends to happen is that the system can be overloaded. It becomes has to clear out. I usually use the analogy of, we've got a kitchen sink, and what's the size of the drain in the kitchen sink, and within that sink we're pouring in these various different hormones and neurotransmitters. And so obviously for women, as estrogen levels start to rise, you're going to have a more significant capacity consumed by the clearance of those that particular hormone. And so what are the implications on that for other neurotransmitters and things like dopamine, for example? So I think that it has some significant implications on, how women respond to it, how they utilize it, and dosing strategies and that. And it's not, I couldn't say definitively that I'd have to spend time with each particular patient to kind of identify, what's going on. So for example, some women either through nutritional deficiencies or genetic variants, don't clear out estrogen as well. They either have a smaller drain or what have you. And so that has implications on mood, which, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn here, but anybody who's in a relationship will have noticed that sometimes, moods change a little bit throughout cycles. And again, that has a lot, in my experience, to do with, again, how these estrogen metabolites are either accumulating, because there's multiple different, metabolites of estrogen based on the molecular structure, what we call 2-hydroxy, 4-hydroxy, and 16-hydroxy alpha estrogens. And each one has a slightly different effect and pathway. And so as those are kind of consuming up different capacity of COMT, then that starts to shift around, the dopamine metabolism, and can lead to, again, mood, anxiety, headaches, pain, cramping, and this type of thing. So I think that's, just from a standpoint of how you deal, with women's health and gynecological health, that's, those estrogen metabolites in that pathway. So when we start taking a look at the endocannabinoid system, well, we see intersection there through, serotonin pathways and dopamine pathways in particular. And then furthermore, things like, the menstrual cycle is regulated through prostaglandins, and prostaglandins are, again, built out of the types of fats that we have, or omega-3, 6, and 9, saturated fats, arachidonic acid, and this type of thing. And those prostaglandins have a significant impact on the lining of the uterus, of the endometrium. And again, so, they help, shut off and open the small blood vessels that are involved in menses. And so, again, one of the things that we work a lot with women is taking a look at your essential fatty acid status. And so, I think the logical extension of that is, well, let's take a look at what happens with the endocannabinoid system. And certainly, we see that, various different endocannabinoids like PEA and this type of thing have an impact on uterine proliferation, endometriosis, ovarian cysts, and such. So I think that's, probably yeah.
Yeah, that's a good snapshot. And, listening to you describe this, on one hand, the detail in your answer is remarkable, because I swear I talk to cannabis researchers all the time, and I do not get this level of detailed answer from most anybody, which, is impressive. But then also at the same time, as somebody who works with patients, daily, it also is kind of frustrating, because I'm like, oh my God, this is the more sentences you say, Chris, the more complex the diagnosis seems to become about what cannabinoids we're going to use to offer relief and strengthening to which part of the human, so they can even use the other cannabinoids with the ailment that we're actually targeting. It's like there's so many layers, and it makes sense, right? I mean, so many people poo-poo the idea of how much good cannabis does. You're like, oh, people think it solves everything. Well, it's like, all right, it doesn't solve everything. It solves one thing, the endocannabinoid system. And the thing is that's the body's thermostat. And so it touches all of the mission critical systems in the body. So yeah, cannabis does really well with this one system, but it's the master regulator. So in a way, yeah, it actually does help everything. And while that makes it such a beneficial herb, at the same time, as a caregiver who's listening to this show, I can imagine it can feel kind of, defeating in a way, where who's got the amount of information about their patient and the time to talk with them about all of this. And we're going to talk more in the second set about the analytics you use. But just speaking to the bigger idea of the complexity of this really suggests to me that we have just scratched the surface of endocannabinoid medicine.
Yeah. And I think this is this speaks to such a larger issue, which is what is healthcare and what is disease care, right? And like I said, I'm integrative, a lot of my naturopathic doctor friends shriek in horror, when I prescribe stuff and things like that. And a lot of my medical doctor friends shriek in horror when I start talking about, holistic approaches and things like that. So I look at myself as a bridge. I try very much to be very grounded in science, but I also recognize that, there's a role. You have to use the right tool, but you have to also have enough information. And our healthcare system at this time, struggles, and especially up here in Canada, I've talked with many of my medical doctor friends, and we have medicine where doctors are, paid by the government and things like that. But, to a large extent, and again, I practice in the US, medicine is determined, on this sort of fee for service model, right? Which means that, okay, well, if you see more patients, you make more revenue out of this. And so, and the efforts around evidence-based medicine and to do these things are to try and create a structured framework to do that, which is, again, it's really helpful when, you're in an emergency room and you're crashing and you're having a heart attack, or you've been in a motor vehicle accident, or you've crashed or something like that as well, too. I mean, these are things where, are super important to have these things that can be acted on quickly and rapidly and be very, very effective. But the model starts to break down as we get more and more into these individual care. And I think, what I struggle with, and what I try, and my one small voice in the wilderness here is to say, like, hey, everybody, it can't just be about cannabis. It actually needs to be about the patient. And like I said, cannabis is an incredible tool. It's very helpful. And as we've talked in our previous conversations, is that, I kind of come from that as saying, like, cannabis is remarkably easy to do something with because it actually works. You can see it happening. I mean, try dealing with, the sort of poking and prodding of some of the other herbal medicines. And so that becomes, it's more difficult. It's more nuanced on this as well, too. So, but what I struggle with here a little bit is that I see cannabis kind of being moved into sort of like, well, THC and CBD, what's the dose, what's the prescribing, and all the rest of that. And we move into what I call sort of, and I'm not the only one, I certainly didn't coin this term, but green allopathy, which is, well, let's just find a green alternative for the medication. So we'll use willow bark or curcumin for aspirin. There's an anti-inflammatory, or will you choose whatever one sort of goes there. And again, I think, trying to bring this patient-centered focus back into it. And I think that's what sort of drew me to the, endocannabinoids and cannabis system, was we started to see patients responding quickly and being able to work fairly, on their own, to be able to sort of manage their own healthcare through accessing cannabis. And now it's sort of like, my job that I kind of look at is, well, let's bring in some of these other stuff that's been, what I'm talking about here isn't new within sort of the integrative medicine naturopathic community. It's just nobody's ever overlaid it on the endocannabinoid system in this particular way. And so, it's just, like I said, my role as a bridge is to try and sort of bring that up. But again, for patients in and of itself, I think most people have a good sense of, how do I optimize nutrition? I think if we sat down and said, okay, what's a healthy diet look like? Most people could tell us. And so I would say, like, well, just recognize how important that is. And not only just in using that in cannabis, but again, also trying to make your cannabis work better for you. And again, do we, as clinicians and people, do we want to keep someone on a medication forever, whether it be cannabis or a pharmaceutical or a herbal medicine? Or do we want to try and build the capacity where patients can take control of their health? Things, okay, I'm out there exercising, I'm getting blood pumping, I'm doing my exercise routine, I'm eating healthy, I've got my diet cleared up as well too. And does that start to say, I use my cannabis to kind of help me get to a certain space, and now I can use it either less frequently or at certain situations because I have the resiliency, because I built on these other aspects.
So another thing that you mentioned that I found very engaging is this phrase that I'm going to start using all the time of medicine by average. And, I know that there are doctors and caregivers who are listening who run into this every day because, first off, just because we work with cannabis, at least up until normalization has begun, the vast majority of patients that we come in contact with, they are already not the average. They are the fringe, because by the time that people get to cannabis medicine, they've usually already tried everything else, right? The idea of like, everybody's parents and grandparents now using, topicals and edibles for their aches and pains. This is really something that has just come into acceptance again, more recently as there are more recreational stores around. But in the transition years that we're in, and certainly in the heritage market, by the time people got to cannabis, Western medicine had already given up on them. And so by its very, nature of the prohibition years, everyone we got was generally not average. They were on the fringe because regular medicine didn't work for them. So then we've got that set of patients, but then also we've got all of these new patients, which, since cannabis medicine can help just about everybody, there's all these people who are served by Western medicine who are now also being served by cannabinopathic care. And I find it both, informative and troubling that the medicine by average really is to the advantage of the health industry and the patient care industry, and not the healthcare industry, as you made that delineation earlier about medicine for health versus medicine to keep you alive, to sell you more medicine, right? And this idea of medicine by average is so frustrating to so many caregivers. I'm not expecting you to have an answer for it, because it's a difficult, paradoxical thing. But what kind of advice would you give to caregivers who are dealing with this, trying to provide individualized medicine in a system that does medicine by average?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and again, I'm so steeped in it. I had this conversation with a patient the other day, and they were like, "Oh my God, this is so frustrating." And it's like, well, this is just the ocean that we kind of swim in as naturopathic physicians. It's something that, is why people come and seek us out. I think that this is the amazing about, podcasts like this in the world that we live in now, is that people are starting to, learn more. And I mean, I think about my own experience in figuring out cannabis, and the people that I've worked with, and just the giants that I've had the opportunity to learn from, right? But my own learning was accelerated that way. But I think at the end of the day, being your own advocate, and starting to sort of say like, hey, wait a second, I have some questions about this and about that, that's key. I mean, that's the most important part of it, and I think the hardest part is, how do you find a clinician that works, that's saying like, well, that's really interesting. And I certainly can't answer you. I mean, I'm always surprised at some of the doctors that are super open to this, and some of that aren't, I mean, I just had a super interesting conversation with a rheumatologist down there your way in Seattle, doing really cool stuff with a heart rate variability and autoimmune illnesses. And we were coming at this from two different ways, but the intersection was remarkable. And I'm like, okay, I've met some rheumatologists, and they can be pretty conservative, right? And so suddenly, to have them move outside of this is really exciting. So, again, I couldn't tell you how, but I think most doctors are seeking, that relationship. I think the epidemic of physician burnout that we have has a lot to do with the loss of sort of the doctor-patient relationship. Doctors are seeking that as much as anyone else, and so I mean, you're gonna have to sort through a bunch of different physicians perhaps until you find one that has that. But I do sympathize with a lot of those doctors, and certainly, the ones that I know socially versus I know professionally. Sometimes there's a bit of a incongruity between the people I know them to be and how they're working in their space, and they're all humans. And so I try and approach that with some compassion and sympathy of how they're doing, and go from there. So again, I don't know if I necessarily have an answer other than to say, to be the advocate, understand your patient, your doctor is probably struggling in a lot of different ways around that. And and reach out and try and engage in conversation. And you'll find some that do and some that don't, which is, maybe horribly naive, but that's what I'll put out there.
Right on. Thank you, Chris. So we're going to take a short break and be right back. And make sure you do come back, because after the break, we are going to be talking about some of the analytics that are available to take a good snapshot of your body or your patient's body so that you can start to thread the needle of individualized cannabis medicine. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest today is naturopathic physician Chris Spooner. As cannabis regulations become more demanding and consumers become more educated, it is increasingly important to avoid the use of chemical pesticides when cultivating cannabis. Beneficial insects have been used for decades by the greenhouse vegetable and ornamental plant industry, and today many cannabis cultivators are moving from sprays and chemicals to beneficial insects. Copert Biological Systems has the beneficial insects, mites, and nematodes, microbials, sticky cards, and air distribution units you need to partner with nature to defend your garden. Whether you manage acres of canopy or have a simple grow tent in your home, Copert is ready to help answer your questions and help you transition away from chemical sprays towards clean and natural solutions. Since 1967, Copert has assisted growers in identifying pests and devising reliable solutions while providing healthy insects and mites that will protect your yield. Since the 1990s, Copert has been a leader in cannabis pest and disease control worldwide and have highly trained consultants to assist you in Canada and the US from coast to coast. No matter where you live, Copert Biological Systems can help. Visit Copert.com, choose your country, and get detailed information. That's Copert, Koppert.com. For the most up-to-date cannabis-related biological control information, you can also check out their Instagram, @CopertCanada. You know getting away from pesticides is good for health and good for business, and Copert is ready to help. Visit Copert.com today. If you're an autoflowering cannabis enthusiast, this event's for you. Announcing the 2021 Autoflower Cup, August 6th, 7th, and 8th in Lillooet, Washington, just outside of Seattle. Presented by Camp Ruderalis, this gathering has something for everyone. There's the Autoflower Cup competition, of course, but it's so much more than that. There'll be a Stunden glass hookah lounge, a pop-up magical butter chocolate shop, and waterfront marketplace with an array of vendors. There will be an old school autoflower seed swap, joint rolling competition, cannabis cooking demos, solventless squishing demos, and late night documentary screenings of both dosed and fantastic fungi. The food will be lit too, including Chef Sebastian Carosi's award-winning classics like elk chili, Kobe beef kimchi dogs, oyster po' boys, and razor clam chowder. Enjoy the campfire chili and oyster chowder cook-off, wild oyster harvesting, mushroom foraging, and s'mores around the campfires each night. Each day there, Dan Jimmy of Mandalorian will teach about autoflowers, and there will be presentations on closet cultivation and hunting for psilocybin mushrooms. The competition is open to everyone, commercial and home growers. There's a category for photoperiod plants too, so check out the autoflowercup2021.com for those details. Clearly, there will be plenty of cannabis around, but due to state law, it won't be supplied by the event. But there will be easy public toking, which is why this is a strictly over 21 event. You can camp, rent a cabin, or stay at a local Airbnb. Glamping and RV packages are available too. I'm happy to say that Shaping Fire is a sponsor of the event, and I'll be there too. I look forward to connecting with other autoflower fans like me. So get all the details at theautoflowercup2021.com and follow the Instagram at theautoflowercup2021. And I'll see you in August at Autoflower Cup when we bring the Autoflower family together to celebrate. While I love growing under the sun, there's a lot of good reasons to grow indoors. And if you're like most folks, you want a lighting source that grows high-yielding, healthy plants without using excessive amounts of electricity. BIOS Lighting creates biological lighting solutions that brings the natural brilliance of the outdoors into your grow room. BIOS Lighting has the attributes that I look for in a horticultural lighting solution. I've bought those cheap lights online, and they're difficult to work with and fail in no time. In contrast, my BIOS LED light is industrial grade to last a long time. It is IP66 wet rated, so little foliar overspray won't harm it. It is easy to clean without taking it down, and of course, the most important aspect, it is built for the exact light spectrum I want for great yielding, healthy cannabis plants. And it doesn't hurt that their lighting rigs look badass too. Many horticultural LED lighting systems are based on irrelevant performance metrics, and people love to argue online about these numbers. I prefer to judge on par photon efficiency and how happy my plants are, and the BIOS lights exceed my expectations in these categories. BIOS lights have an optimized broad spectrum that maximizes photosynthesis and plant growth, while also providing the ideal conditions for superior par efficacy and a comfortable visual experience. I also love their attentive and overeducated customer service folks. BIOS starts with a team of biologists before getting the electrical engineers involved. They have studied how light impacts cannabis plants and devised an overall strategy that works. I encourage you to check out their website at bioslighting.com to learn more about how this strategy can work for you. And Shaping Fire listeners can get a special deal. Use the discount code SHAPINGFIRE, all one word, no caps, for 10% off your entire purchase. That's bioslighting.com. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I'm your host, Shangolos, and our guest this week is naturopathic physician Chris Spooner. So during the first set, we focused on the different variables that can significantly impact the patient's use of cannabinoids. And during the second set, we're going to try to figure out how we suss out which of these variables we need to be able to pay the most attention to when either doing a self-assessment as a patient who is trying to self-heal, or as a doctor or caregiver who is working with a patient and you want to give them the best individualized medicine as possible. So Chris, I guess take us from the top. You know, you've got a new patient and you've got their, questionnaire in front of you, and from our prior talks, I know that there is, I'll call it a battery of tests. I don't know if it's that many, but there are some tests that you rely on to give you your basic information. And, we've all had blood tests. So why don't we start there, something that people have got a frame of reference with, and then continue on through the other analytics that you give your patients.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And it again, it's obviously this is going to fluctuate a little bit, so, I'll give that caveat before we get started here. And certainly if, I may segue into one or two of those if we need to, but yeah, I think, when we're starting off, there's a number of things to factor here, so first of all, what type of testing does a clinician or a patient have access to? I think probably what I try and do is start off with the very basics, basic blood work, blood chemistry, CBC, like complete blood counts, liver function tests, thyroid, these sort of standard things that you can get from any of your medical doctors, or naturopathic physicians, or these are pretty straightforward. So, that's a nice, easy one to do. It's relatively inexpensive. It's, so I think this is a good place to start. Generally what I do is I kind of break this down, and if we're starting with the model or the framework that I suggested about, taking a look at sort of optimizing nutrition here a little bit. There's a couple of markers that you can take a look at within a basic blood work that can give you a general sense of things. So, for example, we could start off with, is someone anemic or not? So a lot of patients may coming in with fatigue and, exhaustion, and fatigue's a pretty, it's a pretty broad-based indicator. But, we can sort of see is like, what's your iron status looking like? Because sometimes you just need to make sure that you're checking off some of the basics, because sometimes there's a tendency to rush off into more exotic, the analysis is, when we hear hooves, think of horses, not zebras, right? And then the qualifiers, unless you're in Africa, but, so there's some contextual component to that as well, too. So certainly just taking a look at, what your red blood cell counts, hematocrit, hemoglobin is, and just making sure you're not running anemic. But within that, one of the ones that I like to pay attention to is it's a decent indicator of things like vitamin B12 and folic acid status. Is what's called the MCV. It's the mean corpuscular volume. So this is basically, the size of your red blood cells. and usually, I mean, the old term for it was a pernicious anemia, which, then we'd give people B12 shots to try and bring it around a little bit if this MCV was a little bit elevated. Up here in Canada, I think we're using the same units. Some of these will vary a little bit, but usually it's above 97. I forget what the number is. You just forget the units. But that usually suggests that these blood cells are a little bit bigger. And the reason that this one's important from an endocannabinoid status is if we go back to this sort of COMT pathway that I was sort of speaking to a little bit earlier. The B vitamins, particularly folic acid, B12, B6, and that are involved in this thing called a methylation pathway. And this methylation pathway is one of these things that creates a compound that supports COMT, S-adenosylmethionine in particular is the one it is. But those your folic acid and your B12 have to be have this little methyl group. It's a little carbon with 3 hydrogens added to it. So you get these methylated B vitamins. And, for people that are in the know about nutritional supplementation, most people tend to use methylated forms of folic acid and B12 because they're active, and we know that these genetic variants aren't there. But certainly if we see the MCV starting to be up there a little bit, it starts to become something like, well, maybe we need to take a look at the B12 status, or take a look at, supplementing someone with that. The other part of this is that pernicious anemia often had something to do with gastric inflammation. B12's absorbed. There's a cofactor for it in the lining of the gut that helps get it absorbed. So if there's irritation to the lining of the stomach, certainly that can compromise absorption as well too. So things like acid blocker medications and that can have impacts on that. So that's one of the, a nice place to start. It's nice and easy. So if you're seeing that MCV being a little bit elevated, well, maybe we need to take a look at sort of the absorption of B12 and its various parameters of that. As we start working down a little bit more, a couple of the other markers that I start to take a look in there, I like to take a look at the white blood cell counts. And this speaks to a larger element that's we need to have a quick conversation about, which is about what are reference ranges, because this very much speaks to our last thing of medicine by average. So I think people need to understand that reference ranges. So when you get a lab test that gives you the number, like for example, CV is 91, and with it you're given a reference range that is 88 through 97, right? And you look at that and you're like, oh, well, that must mean that I'm healthy within this space. Well, you could be or you couldn't, but you need to understand that reference range refers to a population norm. So basically what you're looking at is sort of a 95% of the tests fall within value A and value B, of which there's an upper and lower range, right? And so that really speaks to this sort of medicine by average. And I've always sort of been like, well, if you're one of these people that tends to be up at the upper end of a value, and you drop 10 points, do you feel as bad as a person who's at the lower end of the value and drops 10 points? But one of those falls within the reference range and one of them doesn't. And so that's where this individualized medicine goes, where you need to kind of start to ask some patients some questions about this. And thyroid testing is notorious for this, right? You can see some patients, they just have a range that they feel much better, and that sometimes is inside the reference range and sometimes outside of that.
Hold on, before you continue on, another thing that you just said about the reference range that just surprised me, unless I misunderstood, you said that the reference range comes from the averages of the tests that are taking place. Well, that means that if a population is getting increasingly unhealthy, that the reference range will change as well. Say, for example, in my country, obesity is a scourge here. And so our reference ranges that are attached to obesity would be theoretically moving in the wrong directions. But then also, since it's happening to so many people, our reference range is actually drifting with the population's lack of health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, potentially, and I think, and for some of these tests, there's a long history of what we know, like, blood lipids and things like that, that it's like, okay, well, we know that these issues, I mean, there's a fairly long history of what this looks like. So I think they're a little bit more resistant to that trending in that respect. I don't disagree with you. And I think for example, again, let's go back to thyroid a little bit, because again, there's a lot of interpretation on that, and there's other factors that start to come into this. The thyroid, it's interesting up here in Canada, the depending on the lab, the upper limit of that is 5.5, and I believe that if you cross the border down into Washington State there, I believe the American College for Endocrinology has kind of set it as like under 2.5. So there's a significant difference on where you're classified as, hypothyroid or thyroid. And it may not necessarily be the test so much as what the impact is on your clinician's mindset as to whether this is an issue or not. So someone that's looking at a reference range of up to 5, I would say like, whoa, okay, your thyroid, your TSH level sitting at 4.5, that's a problem. Whereas a physician may not, who's used to seeing it at 5, whereas someone who's trained, or in a different jurisdiction where it's slightly different may look at that and be like, oh yeah, no, I agree, that, you need to be under 2.5. So I think you've got two things there. One is certainly the issue that you're speaking to, but the other one is also the clinician's mindset and how they start to prioritize what to look like, which I think is probably a little bit more, I don't know if insidious is the word, but that's the one that comes to mind right now.
So far we've been talking about the blood test because that's something that we're all kind of familiar with. We've all seen our ranges, and we could probably do an entire show just talking about a blood test and how to go through each aspect of it and how it could impact the endocannabinoid system. And maybe we'll do that. But for today, let's move on, because I think that both patients and caregivers have gotten a good taste of what there could be to unearth in a blood test. I mean, I know that I'm going to go back and look at my recent blood work with whole new eyes now, but let's move on to the next one. So what other analytics do you look at to help get that snapshot so that you know in what ways to diagnose and give protocol to a patient?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the next one that's the biggest one. And we touched on this is healthy hormones, right? So and I tend to use a lot of questionnaires around this. And again, we could probably go quite some time on this, but certainly, like I said, I think when I'm taking a look at this, where I've been spending a lot of time with patients, I don't know whether it's just the patient population that's coming in right at this moment, but certainly, obviously, in the world that we live in now, stress levels are through the roof with people, right? And so super key indicators, that I think really impact endocannabinoid function are things like, that stress hormone, cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine type parts of that. And so that leads me down sort of taking a good hard look at where these stress hormones comes in, and questionnaires are usually, the most straightforward way. I mean, when I start taking a look at adrenal stress, and sort of these elevated cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline pathways, sleep's always a big indicator. I try and get patients to tell me, okay, a little bit, what's your sleep looking like? And if people are coming in, because again, there's different ways that people don't sleep well. And certainly I think, if I take a look at where a vast majority of my patients are using, cannabinoid therapies, it's certainly in the area of sleep. All right. So, but I think that for some patients it works and for some patients it doesn't. And again, that goes into sort of that regulatory effect of, are you sort of winding someone down by having more GABA in their system? Or are they starting to be stressed out, and is this cortisol? And so there's that interplay between the stress response and these neurotransmitters. So what's this question? So sleep. So I ask patients, for example, if I'm trying to root out, okay, is there a stress response? And this is usually something like cortisol is a big one, right? You can get a good indicator about, okay, first of all, are you having difficulty falling asleep at night? And what does that look like? So a patient, for example, that, they need to get to bed by a certain time frame. If they're not in bed and asleep between 9 and 10, suddenly they get a second wind and they're up and about again. That's almost always a pretty good indicator that they're getting a little bit of a second cortisol spike, which is unusual. Your cortisol should be sort of winding down towards the end of the day. It peaks in the morning and then it tapers off throughout the day. But if it starts to come up a little bit at the end of the day, you're going to see this sleep issue, and so that becomes something that will probably impact your response to cannabinoids. Like you may find that the cannabinoids knock you out, and certainly depending on the form that you're using, right? I mean, and I'm sure you've had this conversation many times. Orally, cannabinoids take longer to set in, but you get that 6 to 8 window effect, and you get a little bit more of those psychoactive compounds because of that sort of first pass liver function there a little bit as well too. So, but if some people are vaping or something like that, they may not, or using, different forms of it that have a little bit more rapid onset, that might clear out a little bit more quickly. So, a patient that's vaping, I usually recommend vaping as opposed to smoking, just because of my environmental medicine background, and smoking is not something that I try to discourage as much as possible. An hour and a half, 2 hours in, suddenly they'll be up again. So you really need to take a look at that cortisol response. And again, there's different ways you can deal with that, whether that's meditation, winding down, taking a look at your use of electronics beforehand. What does your stress sleep hygiene look like? There's some herbs that I use that are quite helpful in there that kind of synergize nicely with cannabinoids there as well too. So that's
a really interesting point about the lights in the evenings and that second potential cortisol spike, because clearly I talk with patients about sleeping and cannabis all the time, and the number one thing that comes up with people is I ask them, do you drink coffee, right? Because people are like, oh, I've got such insomnia, but like I know that coffee's got a half-life of 14 hours. And so that means that by the time they're drinking their coffee tomorrow, they still have this morning's coffee still in them. And so I encourage them to, cut down on or get rid of the coffee or caffeine, and, their insomnia will probably go away. And, after they look at me with utter shock, they're all like, listen, I'd rather keep the caffeine and just use more THC to get to sleep, right? I mean, that's not uncommon. Yeah. But this idea of the blue lights and using electronics at night, of which I am absolutely guilty of, it's an interesting idea that if poor sleep is decreasing our cannabinoid uptake and effectiveness, and poor sleep comes from using my phone in bed at night and getting a second wind and hanging out for 2 hours on bed reading stuff, if we backtrack that all the way back, my using my devices at night is hurting my endocannabinoid system, and that is not something I think is immediately apparent to most folks. It certainly wasn't to me until now.
Yeah, and certainly, again, if you think about it in the context of a thermostat, right? My thermostat goes and tries to heat the house, but if I've got the windows and doors open, well, that's going to be a little bit more difficult.
Good example, yeah.
Right. There's only so much capacity that you can, and I think that and this touches on some of the genetics that we talked about. It talks about sort of the nutritional capacity. It talks about the hormonal environment. All those things. So again, it's sort of like, okay, how do I optimize the system? And this is the interesting thing, right? Is I think that the thing that's become most apparent to me here is that your body. It seems to me, and there's probably people that are much smarter than me that could that could explain this or maybe poke holes in this argument. So please feel free to. I'd love to learn about this. But what I find is, for example, like let's take a look at the stress response and talk about inflammation. And what I want to use this example to demonstrate is it isn't turn one on, turn one off. It's turn both on and then turn one off. So what ends up happening is you get a faster response if you have the sort of, the driver and the inhibitor going at the same time. So there's a tension created in the system, right? And what happens is that, so for example, when we take a look at cortisol response, cortisol is a immunosuppressant, right? It's an anti-inflammatory. Anybody that's taken prednisone or will appreciate that. So it's a very powerful anti-inflammatory. At the same time, corticotrophic releasing hormone, which is the hormone that stimulates the response of that, also has an impact on vagal nerve tone which drives a pro-inflammatory response. So you've got the same mechanism, like different branches of the cortisol response being anti-inflammatory, but then pro-inflammatory at the same time. And if you think about it, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to run away from, I'll use a distinctly Canadian response, the grizzly bear. You don't want to wait for your system to come online if they've, given you a club or two and you're running away like crazy. So you want your system to come online. So basically, as your stress response drops, suddenly it unleashes the anti-inflammatory effect, on your nervous system, which is wired to get you the hell out of Dodge, suddenly shuts down and calms down. Now the other one can basically cascade in on it. So I think the endocannabinoid system probably has that same type of tension in there. And then you've got all these other modifiers around it as well, too. And when we talk about the lack of sleep or the dietary issues on top of that, suddenly you're taking away, you're limiting the resiliency of it. You're kind of sort of cornering it in a little bit so that you limit that response a bit that way.
Wow. All right. So far we have talked about the analytics that are helpful that come from blood tests and hormone tests, and you've alluded a couple times to genetic screens and especially the 23andMe. And again, you already mentioned this, but we're going to set aside the concerns that many people have about whether or not there are identifying aspects of their health that are going into these large data sets and whether or not people want to participate. We're just going to set that aside for this conversation because, again, that's a whole nother show. What we're going to focus on, though, is the usefulness of this kind of a test for the patient. So what do these variety of tests show us that is worth noting?
Sure. Yeah. So again, you can break this out into the endocannabinoid genetics, and then the nutritional stuff, and sort of hormone metabolism, things like that. And so where I start to take a look at here is, some of the things you can start to see is, the cannabinoid receptor and dopamine receptors and such. You see some genetic variants where, these receptors are more responsive or less responsive, and that starts to set up, are some patients more likely to become a little bit more hooked on habitual cannabis use. They get the reward seeking response from that a little bit, and they tend to go down that pathway. So certainly that's something to be aware of, when you're taking a look and what you're going to provide from a formulation standpoint. So there's that aspect of it. We can also start to dig into some of these enzymes that drive the different aspects of the cannabinoid system, right? So you can take a look at FA, fatty acid amide hydrolase, MAGL, another one as well too, and degrade that. And those enzymes kind of give a sense of how quickly these endocannabinoids hang around inside your synapse, the gap between your nerves on that as well too. So again, it just gives you a sense of what's the resiliency of that system. So you can start to build out some sense of that. Certainly where I start to take a look at it is things like, because most patients come in here, and again, I think your comment a bit earlier on about how we tend to have a patient population that have exhausted other options. We tend to have a little bit more of the canaries in the coal mine. So certainly I tend to see some of the stuff that I also saw in my multiply chemically sensitive patients, which is that, which is a very similar population in some respects, is that they have genetic variants and things like their ability to clear out these enzymes. For example, if we are these compounds, like let's talk about your caffeine example that you used. Some people genetically don't clear out caffeine well. Some do just fine, and so, these are, and again, I suspect that the people that are a little bit more sensitive to caffeine, are again, sort of these people that have some of these genetic variants about clearance of cytochrome enzymes and that may impact clearance of other medications and other substances. It's, again, a whole other conversation. We can talk about Google's, I think it's called Alpha One is their new artificial intelligence that looks at protein folding on it. And it came up with some really interesting stuff, which is that, sort of genes appear to organize in biochemical pathways, so that, they kind of support each other. So, like, for example, I did 23andMe, and it turns out that I'm genetically pre-programmed to have cod liver oil. My Swedish and Swiss background pretty much means that I don't do vitamin D terribly well. My vitamin A, I don't convert it from plants terribly well, and my oils, the plant-based oils, I can't really convert them into the sort of the omega-3 stuff that we find in fish oils. But that group of them, I've seen that repeatedly in patient populations, that people of Northern European descent and things like that, and some of the First Nations populations, seem to have these things where their vitamin D and their essential fatty acids and fat soluble vitamins seem to be tied together. And we see this in other different elements as well too. So that's a really cool element of it. And then we go down the pathway of things like, again, depending on what our patients are looking at. So, anxiety, stress, mood, depression, chronic pain. I really start taking a look at a lot of the tryptophan stuff around this as well too. There's some really interesting aspects, because that ties in both with the B vitamins that we talked a little bit earlier about folic acid, B12, and B6 support, and then also the ability to convert, the amino acid tryptophan into 5-hydroxytryptophan. And so there's some genetic variation on that too. So these are the types of things that, as you start to take a look, they show up, and different platforms have different elements of it. I just use the 23andMe raw data and load that into a multiple of different, genomic platforms to start to identify those. And, there's several of them that I use. I'm working on one right now with another company to try and make a little bit more specific sort of functional cannabinoid medicine platform. And so hopefully we'll have that out in the next year or so.
That's going to be popular.
I hope so. Yeah. I think it'd be interesting. The challenge is trying to simplify this stuff down, because, again, I realize I'm probably just, people are kind of getting a fire hose effect right now, and I'm getting little snippets of it as well. But hopefully we could make it much more practical and patient friendly. So,
and that idea of being overwhelmed by the details, like, that's not lost on me. Like, you're right. We are kind of moving around, and there's a lot of vocabulary in this episode, but it's also true to life, right? Like, this is what it's like to be a patient. Like, anybody who is still with us on the episode, people have got to decide that they're going to care enough to learn the vocabulary if they are going to become captains of their own health. We cannot have optimum health, let alone individualized cannabis medicine, in a Western healthcare system that is designed more to keep us on pharmaceuticals than it is to heal us and move us on our way. And so, while at certain times the vocabulary that you've used even, washed me in new ideas. I'm like, oh, I've got a long list of things that I'm going to Google when we're done here. But that's what it's like to be a patient. That is what it's like. And so, I think that cannabis patients, probably more than most, are used to this, because we've already talked about how cannabis patients are generally outliers because the rest of the medical system has given up on them. And then they've had to take their research into their own hands. And so those are probably the people that this episode is most targeted for, because what we're giving, from helping enough of my friends, like, I've got rheumatoid arthritis friends and hypothyroid friends and all these folks. There are little snippets throughout the episode where people are like, ooh, there's a new search term for me that I had not considered on whatever topic. And I think that's how self-empowered patients have to go about their medical education. So anyway, I agree with you, and I think it's par for the course.
Yeah, well, and I would say again, this is interesting because, again, when I take a look, I've been a naturopathic doctor now graduated in 1998. And so, I had, undergraduate and naturopathic college as well with that for 5 years, 5 years of naturopathic college, 4 years of undergraduate. So I've kind of been steeped in this for a really long time in terms of this integrative alternative medicine. What we're talking about in cannabis medicine isn't new. This is something that sort of the holistic integrative medicine. When I started off in this area, I remember going down, and I grew up in Victoria on Vancouver Island. And I remember going down to the Chinatown and getting Chinese herbal medicines and walking into this, and it was just, the smells and this, you're just like, oh my God, this is just so fascinating, But there's a little Chinese fellow, giving me all these herbs, these wonderful herbs, and it was just, and now we take a look and go into any, sort of, choices, integrative pharmacy, whatever, and you see what the evolutions look like. And cannabis is has the potential, and just following that same course, but just at a very magnified effect, simply because the population behind that's driving it is I think there's this pent up demand, and suddenly it released, and so now it's moving. But I mean, what you're talking about with cannabis patients is exactly what I find in my patient population that's non-cannabis. They're all very engaged. They're doing the research. I have these conversations with them. I mean, I never underestimate the capacity of my patients, to understand the concepts that I'm giving them. It's if they're not getting it, it's because I'm not doing a good enough job explaining it, right? So I need to come back around and find out that language that's going there. And so I know that we've slipped into some jargon around that, but again, certainly, you can sort of dial that back in a lot of different ways. But it's patients being empowered. It's patients starting to look into this, saying, look, I don't. The current model is not serving us well. The symptom-oriented thing, we're just dealing with a symptom, is kind of the equivalent of pulling the batteries out of my smoke alarm while there's toast burning in my toaster. Right? It gets rid of the irritation on it, but there's still this underlying issue that's kind of happening here a little bit that needs to be addressed. And I think that's what patients are just struggling to find. And there's just a medical system that they're trained to look at that. And it's like, okay, well, I need to I always joke with my patients a little bit. It's like, your doctor is concerned with you not dying. They don't really care about how you feel about it. Right. And I don't mean that to be overly critical. It means, like, look, they've got more pressing things. Just make sure you're not dead. The fact that you've got a little bit of body aches and pains because you're taking your stat, and they're like, well, this is what it is. At least you're not going to die of a heart attack, right? So the intention behind that is caring and genuine and all the rest of that. It's just that, what are they going to do about it? Like, what's the tool that they're going to have? I mean, the option for them is to put them on the medication, switch it around a little bit, or stop it. But again, all of us, I mean, even in this conversation, I mean, there's a deluge. I mean, this has been 20 years of experience that I've got locked up into my brain. I think that it would be unfair to expect someone else to try and have that same type of experience and be able to bring that to bear. And so you do what you do. And just like, I don't know, I mean, there's a billion different topics you could bring up that I'm like, I don't know a hell of a lot about that one. I'm going to need to go do some work on that and talk to some people. So I think at the end of the day, you build a healthcare team of people. You become your best advocate. You do your homework on this. You be inquisitive and curious, and you persist.
Here on Vashon, where I live, Vashon Island, about, I don't know, gosh, has it been 6 years now? We formed a patient and cannabis enthusiast community social group here called Vimea. And, we continually use this term, scrappy street medicine, because so many of the people who have come to endocannabinopathic medicine because they were fringe and black swans and outside of the medicine by average, they have had to self-teach. And certainly before Google, it was, nearly impossible to do this kind of research, but it's becoming easier and easier. And we all have kind of embraced this idea that we work together to bring our pre-existing scrappy street medicine out of the bro science and into an understanding that you're talking about of integrative medicine that's been around for a while, but also has had the difficulty of not being incredibly popular or accessible to most people, and is not taught in regular school, right? And so, even though to you, you've been studying this for over 20 years, for most of us, just simple stuff like including environmental medicine, what in your house is off-gassing something, can be mind-blowing, because a lot of people are taught that, all the industrial manufacturing is fine, and so that's how that's how a lot of folks come up, right? As scrappy street medicine folks who then get access to professionals like you who are now more accessible to us in cannabis, because you're not shamed and it's not as taboo to come on a podcast like this, and we get to hear some hints and best practices from somebody who's inside the specialty. So before we wrap up and go to our next commercial break, Chris, were there any other tests that you wanted to make sure that you pointed out for caregivers or patients that they'll want to take a look at for clues? You've mentioned the blood tests, hormone tests, and the genetic screens so far.
Sure. I think probably the last ones would be that what I kind of touched on was the fats part of it, right? There's some questionnaires that I use, things like, do you have dry skin? What's with inflammation? There's some different conditions that you can use to get a sense of, what the fatty acid status is. And for the most part, if you've got dry, scaly skin that's always dry, you probably are pretty much deficient in fats. So there you go. You might take a look at things like vitamin D status. That's an easy test to run. It has significant impacts, especially for those of us, up near the border and above the border here, above the wall, so to speak.
Yeah.
So those are important things that I think are elements of it. There's one last blood work test that I like. There's one called GGT. It's a liver enzyme. It's usually used to test for alcohol. Most doctors will look at it if it's elevated and say you need to stop drinking. And but what it is actually is it's a decent marker for something called glutathione, which is a super important antioxidant. It's built out of an amino acid called N-acetylcysteine that actually is showing some real promise in things like helping with addiction and neurotransmitters, certain neuroplasticity, brain health, Parkinson's, antioxidant status, this type of thing. And I think that's one that I tend to check a lot. And I take a look at those numbers. And it's one of those ones that, even though the upper level of it is fairly high, there's been some interesting papers published that showed it's actually based on insurance actuarial tables that show that suboptimal levels occur at much lower levels within the normal range of that as well too. So that's a big one that I like to take a look at as well too.
Awesome. Thank you. So we're going to go ahead and take that second short break and be right back. After the break, we are going to go into talking about whole foods, your diet, and how you can support your endocannabinoid system through your food choices. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest today is naturopathic physician Chris Spooner. One of the reasons why no-till cannabis growing is so valued by farmers is because the mycelium networks in the soil remain established from year to year. And we know these fungal networks are essential because they are the nutrient superhighways that extend far and wide in the substrate to feed your plants. The trouble with growing in new living soils or blended cocoa substrates is that it takes most of the plant's life just to create these mycelium highways. Dinomyco endomycorrhizal fungi inoculant reduces that time and gets your plant eating a wider array of nutrients faster. And it's 3 times the concentration of the other popular brand in the US at 900 propagules per gram of 2 fungal species selected specifically for cannabis cultivation. Dinomyco is the result of 30 years of research and trials at the Volcani Agriculture Research Institute in Israel. It has also been vigorously trialed by cannabis and food growers across the U.S. Dinomyco is now available at grow shops and on Amazon in the United States. I love using Dinomyco to both speed up the growth of the mycelium networks in the soil, but also as a biostimulant to make clone cuttings more virile. You can see side-by-sides showing the comparative growth on their Instagram at Dinomyco. If you demand reliable growing results and appreciate the importance of an active root zone in creating a thriving plant, I encourage you to check out dinomyco.com and use the store locator to find out where you can get yours. That's DYNOMYCO.com. Shaping Fire listeners can get 10% off any size of Dynamyco on Amazon or dynamyco.com by using the discount code SHAPINGFIRE, one word, no caps. Whether you are starting with new beds or pots, or if you want to add some zing to tired soil, choose Dynamyco to maximize your plant's potential. Dynamyco Endomycorrhizal Inoculant. With the National Hemp Program in flux due to stringent THC testing requirements, brothers Seth and Eric Crawford continue to release seeds to hemp farmers that will be legal, no matter how you grow them or when you test them. These new varieties from Oregon CBD Seeds have substantial amounts of CBDV, CBGV, CBCV, and THCV, while always staying below the 0.3% THC limit and guaranteeing compliant crops for farmers every time. Also, these new varieties cannot be pollinated by your neighbor's uncontrolled pollen or a rogue male in your own crop either. Oregon CBD Seeds are non-GMO certified too. Oregon CBD Seeds was founded and funded in 2015 by Seth and Eric, maxing out their personal credit cards without outside investment. They continue to refuse outside investment that would change their company culture. Oregon CBD grows tons of fresh food on their research farms for local food banks, literally tons of food. They also give away tens of thousands of pounds of R&D flower to patients. As their company began to succeed, Seth and Eric started donating money to the cannabis medicine and hemp fiber cause too, by giving millions of dollars to Oregon State University in order to establish the world's leading cannabis genomics research program. And they treat their employees right. Oregon CBD pays for full health and dental coverage for their employees, a 401k program, and their minimum starting wage is $20 an hour. Plus, everyone shares food from the farms. Seth has been on Shaping Fire a few times to talk about novel cannabinoids. You can check out episodes 25 and 37 on CBD cultivars in the hemp market, episode 66 on triploid cannabis genetics, and the very first Shaping Fire Live, episode 47, with Seth and soil expert Jeff Lowenfels talking about autoflowers. If you are a hemp farmer and you want to grow reliable seeds that are sure to thrive in past testing, check out OregonCBDseeds.com to learn more about buying seeds for the 2021 season. That's OregonCBDseeds.com. This message is for folks who grow cannabis. I'm talking to home growers, patients, and commercial growers too. I'm probably talking to you. When you plan out your next growing cycle, be sure to check out Humboldt CSI seeds at HumboldtCSI.com. Caleb Inspecta and his family have lived in Humboldt County for over 100 years. For the last 40 years, 3 generations of his family have cultivated extraordinary Sensimilla cannabis in Humboldt, Mendocino, and Trinity counties. Because of his lineage and the hard-earned experience that comes from growing up, smoking, and sifting large populations of cannabis plants in Northern California, the seeds you'll cop from CSI will be winning genetics based on longtime heavy hitters and updated and resifted to bring out new and exotic traits and better yields. Go ahead and ask around. Caleb, also known as Inspecta and Pirates of the Emerald Triangle, is a breeder's breeder. He reaches way back and works with significant strains, recreating them in new and interesting ways that you'll love as a toker and a grower, as well as offering you some surprises that will delight serious seed traders and cultivators. Humboldt CSI goes a further step and selfs all these chemovars so you know all the seeds will be female. These are not experimental feminized seeds. Humboldt CSI releases some of the best female seeds available anywhere, and it will show in your garden. Folks grew quite a bit of CSI Humboldt genetics last year here on Vashon Island, and everyone was pleased. The patients had beautiful female plants and didn't have to cull half of their garden as males. The folks growing for the fun of getting high grew colorful flowers with exceptional bag appeal and great highs. And breeders had 7 out of 7 females in a pack, which gave them a lot of phenotypic choices. Take a moment right now and visit HumboldtCSI.com. You'll find an up-to-date menu of both feminized and regular lines, along with photos and descriptions. That's HumboldtCSI.com. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I am your host, Shango Los, and our guest this week is naturopathic physician Chris Spooner. So, in the first two sets, we talked primarily about figuring out what might be the problem and how best and what kinds of cannabinoids that we want to introduce into your body for optimum benefit from your cannabinopathic care. And as we have sussed out that it can get really complex fast, and the context for every single patient is slightly different. And so today's episode has not been the same solutions for everybody. It's essentially, here are a bunch of things to consider, and then now you have to go on your own individualized path. Well, set 3 is going to be a little different because we're going to be talking about the foods that you can eat that generally strengthen your endocannabinoid system. And this is especially great, especially for folks who either want to round out their cannabis use with food that's going to support their endocannabinoid system, or folks who just can't really afford all the cannabinoids that they need, but they do have access to clean food. So, we've talked in the past with Dr. Russo on an earlier episode about his seminal paper about particular foods that strengthen the endocannabinoid system, but that has not been updated in a long time. And Chris, I know that you work with patients all the time, both as a naturopath, but also in your specificity of the gut, right? And so you're talking about the foods that they're eating all the time. So why don't we start with the recommendations that you give your patient base on foods that they should eat for endocannabinoid health?
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, I think we've touched on a lot of these things. I think you probably wouldn't be too surprising given our previous conversation, but I try, patients sometimes prefer supplements. I prefer to try and get patients to do as much as food-wise as they can to start off with. And so, I mean, I'd probably say for those of you that have been listening, the first one I'd be going with is something like cod liver oil. I mean, most people, they're looking at it going like, well, that just sounds downright disgusting. But one of the things I really like about it is that it's got a couple things. It's got vitamin A and vitamin D in it, okay, which is fantastic, and so for those people that genetically aren't able to do it, it kind of bypasses, that issue. And then you've got, cod liver oil actually has a fair amount of what's called DHA in it, which is one of these essential fatty acids that's really helpful for brain health, and its partner, sort of EPA, is a bit of an anti-inflammatory. So I find that, for those patients that are coming in with inflammatory illnesses or neurological stuff, or, inflammatory conditions like fibromyalgia and this type of thing, I mean, this is a good place to start, arthritis, pain, this type of thing, So, tablespoon of cod liver oil, gets you your A's and your D's, your fat-soluble vitamins, and those important essential fatty acids, and it's, again, we could certainly dig down deeper into the science behind why that is and whatever, but, I mean, we do see that, omega-3 deficiencies definitely really impact the, sort of endocannabinoid, particularly the neuronal functions as well, too, but also synergizes quite nicely through the anti-inflammatory effects. So it synergizes really nicely with things like CBD. So that would be probably one of the first ones I'd be taking a look at there as well, too. The next one that I'm super fascinated by is this whole concept of the microbiome, right? And so what I think that you start taking a look at here is this whole, I forget what the paper was here. I'm just going to pull it up here real quick. It was, endocannabinoids, the crossroad between the gut microbiota and host metabolism. It was actually published in Nature, I think in 2016. A super fascinating article about this that talks about the role of the microbiome and actually how it impacts a lot of liver pathology. I don't know. I suspect this isn't something that shows up on everybody's radar, but is in epidemic proportions here, right? And we always attributed that with alcohol use. Well, it turns out it actually has a pretty significant component of disruptions in the gut microbiome, and that seems to be impacted by endocannabinoids, interestingly enough. So taking a look at what's happening within that gut bacteria within the digestive tract, I think is hugely important. And, again, I could go on and on about the trials and tribulations and the disrespect shown to our hepatic liver system. But I won't stand up for them on that soapbox right now. But I certainly think, anything that supports the bacteria in your gut. And that would be something like, a probiotic. If you want to go down, the foods that you would be looking at, you'd be taking a look at fermented foods, your sauerkrauts, your yogurts, these types of things that really, they do two things. One, they supply bacteria. And again, there's a lot of subtleties in the quality of probiotics and that certainly, again, we could go on long and on, but suffice it to say, a lot of the fiber and a lot of the fermented byproducts. So for example, in yogurt and milk products, the sugar lactose is composed of galactose and glucose. Well, you can get what's called a galacto-oligosaccharide, which turns out to be very helpful for the gut microbiome, and that's produced in yogurt, along with sort of the fermentation products and the sort of pH altering effects of that, the lactic acid. So I think fermented foods, if you're dairy sensitive or things like that, you could take a look at other different fermented foods in there, but I think that's a super important thing.
And also a lot of people who are sensitive to dairy foods like I am actually are okay with the fermented ones. So you won't see me drinking a glass of milk, but I can totally handle quality yogurt.
Absolutely, yeah. And especially if you get like a grass-fed yogurt. And why is that? Well, it actually dovetails with the types of fats. Grass-fed animals have different omega-3 fatty acid profiles in their milk that are skewed to the more beneficial ones too. So there's a double whammy with stuff like that. So if you could certainly tolerate a grass-fed yogurt, great, fantastic. Goat's yogurt is probably another one that you could look at if you're not too averse to goaty flavors. But you could go from there. So that would be something that I think are definitely things you can involve in there. Fiber is super important, especially for large bacteria. This is, again, I'm not going to go too far down this rabbit hole, but let's just suffice it to say that your gut bacteria is not the same below the stomach as it is in the large intestine. It varies significantly in the types of bacteria, what they do and what they produce and what they eat. And the ones that we really want to emphasize, going back to that conversation about butyrate, that's, again, adding things like oat bran and psyllium husks and things like that. Those are the two big ones that I recommend on a regular basis. But anything that's, you could add, the healthy fibers into it. And again, some people have sensitivities around gluten and this type of thing. So, this is where, again, a gluten-free oat or something along those lines might be something to consider there. Rice brands can be part of that start to bypass that as well too. But getting in those fibers that the bacteria can start to work on and produce some of these really important compounds, I think is really, really important. And again, we could spend hours talking about that. But I think if I were to make those three recommendations to patients, that would be it. As a dietary strategy overall, I tend to encourage patients to move more towards that paleo, keto type end of things. And this is recognizing that not all diets, there's a lot of caveats that go in this. And certainly I'm not of the view of, paleo means eat red meat and bacon and cream. It means, Mediterranean type diets, olive oils, healthy oils, fish, avocado, coconut oils, organic safflower, sunflower oils, flax oils, those types of things, healthy nuts and seeds, and again, I think most people would be like, yeah, it sounds like a healthy diet. I should probably do some more of that. So if you're really trying to improve your endocannabinoid tone, that's where I'd be leading, and that's where I send most of my patients.
And then, so let's look at the opposite, right? You mentioned earlier the idea of, having the heating on in your house, but then having the window open. So yeah, you might be heating your house, but all the good it's doing is just going right out the window. And I see that so often when I go to conventions and, people are all talking about, cannabis medicine and patients, and then we break for lunch and I watch these people eating like the crackiest, fast food. And I'm like, oh, essentially they're leaving their window open, right? They know about health, but then they're actually putting, tinder into their body instead of like nice long burning logs, right?
Exactly.
So will you speak a little bit to the harm that processed foods do to the endocannabinoid system? Because we want to increase the quality of the foods we are eating, but at the same time, we really should be getting rid of these other foods that are actually causing damage to the endocannabinoid system at the same time.
Yeah, and again, most people when they see a naturopathic physician, they're pretty much being, well, he's going to take me off sugar, dairy, and wheat. So I might as well fit the stereotype and don't do that. But no, definitely, I think when you take a look at particularly your processed foods, I mean, there's a number of different things that come into it. I mean, um, and maybe there's a couple of reasons that might surprise people. If anybody wants an interesting read on it, there's a book, Sugar, Salt, Fat, that talks about, sort of the fast food industry and the processed food industry, and it was essentially an investigative journalist that had heard that a lot of the foods, big companies, General Mills, Nabisco, and all the rest that got together. And one of them was kind of saying, like, one of the individuals was being like, look, we may be kind of moving into cigarette territory here, where suddenly it's going to become apparent that there were some real health benefits that we kind of knew about that we kind of pushed. And so it's a fascinating read. But aside from the fact that something like, your hydrogenated fats and your trans fats, the problem is that these fats are odd lengths. Like when you're taking a look at essential fatty acids, they're, 16, 18, 20, 22 carbon molecules strung together with different bends. The omega-3, for example, talks about you have a bend in the fat. If you think of it as a pipe cleaner, there's a bend at, the third carbon in, whereas an omega-6, it's the sixth carbon in. So these hydrogenated fats have these bends and these lengths that are just odd. Your system doesn't quite know what to do with it. So I kind of liken it to gumming up the works. So when you're putting these fats into your body, suddenly you're getting this odd kind of, your body's like, what do I do with this? And what do I make with it? And so when we, extend this to the thing of like, hey, omega-3 deficiencies have impacts on your endocannabinoid tone because some of the important endocannabinoids are associated with those. Well, if you start throwing more of these fats and they start to predominate in your system, then that starts to become problematic. Sugars and things like that. It's not so much. I mean, heaven forbid, I can be a bit of a chocoholic myself at times as well too. So I think there's an important balance. I kind of use the 80-20 rule. 80% of the time I'm good, 20% of the time I enjoy stuff. And I like a nice, something tasty every once in a while. So I try not to be too obsessive about it. But as your health challenges mount up, that becomes less and less over time. But I think arguably, some of the larger issues that we see in the context of health, inflammation, insulin, blood glucose issues are there. So carbohydrates start to become super important, and really trying to making sure that we're getting our carbohydrates that have a lot of fiber. And the analogy that you use, like a quick burning piece of newspaper in your fireplace burning a log. There's a difference between a steel cut oat versus oat flour, which I equate to similar type of burn times, So I think trying to get your carbs as unrefined, as unprocessed, as whole as possible is where I would be suggesting that way as well too, to help limit those blood sugar swings and those insulin response, and thereby, probably being at the base of the pyramid.
I think your 80-20, it fits for so many things, but in this case, I think that most folks are probably 80% eating questionable food and 20% eating healthy food, but really remembering the 20% that was good. And so, most folks seem to be kind of out of touch. It's amazing the power of a food journal to really get to the bottom of what you're eating. Every single time in my life that I have done a food journal, I have been shocked and disappointed in myself for what I'm actually eating in real life versus what I think I'm eating.
Yeah. And that's something I do with patients all the time. I give a minimum of a 2-week diet diary with all of my patients. And it's not so much, and I can do all sorts of different things. I do like interventional pain management. I can stick needles in people's backs and joints and things like that. And they'll be like, yeah, and ask them to stop, do a diet diary. You'd think I was, trying to remove one of their limbs or something.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's challenging, but I tell them, it's like, look, this isn't really for me. Most patients usually after about a week or so start getting the general gist, and they start modifying their diet all by themselves. And really a sneaky little trick I do is I just keep on giving them diet all by themselves.
You dropped out there right there. What was the thing? What was the very last thing you said?
Yeah, usually I just give them diet diaries for 3-4 weeks, and they just start making changes all by themselves.
Oh, good.
I don't even need to tell them anything. They're like, they know what they need.
It becomes so apparent themselves. Yeah.
Yeah.
So a corollary to the sugar, of course, is alcohol. So how will using alcohol, like processed food, degrade our endocannabinoid system?
Yeah, I think, again, alcohol, there's a context to it. I mean, it depends on the type of alcohol and how much you're drinking. I mean, we've got the French paradox where, a glass of red wine and things like that's not really too much of an issue. And in fact, there may be some health benefits because it helps you relax and unwind and things like that as well, too. But some people, again, genetically have problems metabolizing alcohol. And so that can be an issue. And certainly we know, I mean, my general experience, and this comes from my environmental medicine stuff, is that things like alcoholism and that there was some really interesting stuff that we saw around serotonin, tryptophan metabolism and that in there. So again, there's that intersection. So I don't know exactly where it all in there. But I do tell patients like, look, let's take a look at your alcohol consumption, because again, you could potentially, limiting your resiliency, because you're starting to consume bandwidth in your endocannabinoid tone through these disruptions in serotonin pathways, and then these also little metabolites that your body has to clear out as well too. I think that the next issue that starts to become problematic in that is that I find that a lot of patients have going to the gut microbiome, like yeast issues, and it's not uncommon to see patients have sort of sensitivity to yeasts because of particularly, and no disrespect to the craft beer industry, but they tend to have a little bit more yeasty type stuff in there as well too. So I see sometimes that's a problem. So I tend to tell patients, with a lot of GI issues to watch out for stuff with high yeast contents, and whether that's craft beers or homemade wines or things like that. So that's another option of it as well too, to get them to consider.
Right on. So let's do a little summary here before we wrap up there, Chris. So, as we've already recognized, we were a little, I don't know, we were kind of like shooting like shotgun pellets, right? Kind of a little bit scattered, but we covered a wide breadth of area so that hopefully we were able to provide new search terms and new, I don't know, paradigms, new ideas, new approaches mentally for both caregivers who are intaking a new patient and want to help them with their endocannabinoid system, as well as self-directed, cannabis enthusiasts who are trying to do it better. And so, there's kind of something for everybody in this show, but to kind of summarize it, I'm going to ask you for recommendations for two different kinds of listeners. What would be kind of your summary recommendation for someone coming to use cannabis medicine or food for health for the first time? And then what are your recommendations for long-term cannabis users who already, are using cannabinoids, but they want to be more effective?
Right. So as a clinician, the thing that as you probably got, I like lots of information, right? And I think the more we understand about, what we're using and what we're dealing with, that helps inform our decision-making process and helps us make better decisions. So, for someone who's new to cannabis, who's, where would I start? Again, obviously, we're taking a look at what's your overall health. What is it that we're dealing with? Are you looking at inflammatory conditions? Are you looking at gut injury? So get your medical records. Review what's going on here a little bit. Try and get a sense of, okay, what's my overall health looking like? And then dietary wise, spend some time and just do the basic nutritional stuff. Take a look at that, clean up the diet, get some exercise going, optimize your potential. These are really basic things, and there's lots of different tools that are out there. There's apps and fitness bits and things like that. So I certainly encourage patients to do that. When it comes down to the cannabis itself, which we haven't really touched on yet, but I think this answer kind of goes into where I suggest both my more experienced cannabis patients, which I would give the same recommendations to as the new patients, but from a cannabis standpoint, is know what you're getting. Like, I think the biggest issue that I see here is that formulations, and we don't know what's in it. We don't know the ratios of your CBD, your THC, the terpene profiles. You don't know how it's being extracted, what's there with it as well too. So, know what's going into your bodies. And if I were to summarize everything that we're talking about, whether it's diet or whether it's cannabis, it's like, know what you're doing, get your information, understand what it is that you're eating, what you're doing, what's in your food, understand what's in your cannabis, and and get that and be thorough about it. You have to be your own advocate, and knowledge is power.
Fantastic. Well, Chris, thank you so much for spending your time and your expertise with us. When Dr. Russo recommended you to me after I initiated a conversation with Individualized Cannabis Medicine, he's all, you really need to check out my friend Chris up in Canada. And I saw who you were on the internet, but then when we started talking, I'm like, holy hell, this guy has got really unique information that I haven't seen elsewhere. And that has been my experience today. So I really appreciate both your expertise and your good cheer.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed this, so thank you so much.
Excellent. Well, I hope you will come back another time. So,
absolutely.
So if you want to connect with Chris or just find out more about his practice, you can reach out to him at paradigmnaturopathic.com. You can find more episodes of the Shaping Fire podcast and subscribe to the show at shapingfire.com and wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed the show, we'd really appreciate it if you would leave a positive review of the podcast wherever you download. Your review will help others find the show so they can enjoy it too. On the Shaping Fire website, you can also subscribe to the newsletter for insights into the latest cannabis news, exclusive videos, and giveaways. On the Shaping Fire website, you will also find transcripts of today's podcast as well. Be sure to follow on Instagram for all original content not found on the podcast. That's at Shaping Fire and at Shango Los on Instagram. Be sure to check out the Shaping Fire YouTube channel for exclusive interviews, farm tours, and cannabis lectures. Does your company want to reach our national audience of cannabis enthusiasts? Email hotspot@shapingfire.com to find out how. Thanks for listening to Shaping Fire. I've been your host, Shango Los.